The handcuffs were cold against Luke's wrists. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking violently. No, please, he's lying. My voice cracked, raw and desperate, echoing down the quiet suburban street. Miles stood a few feet away, perfectly composed, almost smiling. His tailored suit was pristine, not a thread out of place. "Vanessa, sit down. You're overreacting," he said softly. His words were honey dripping from a poisoned bottle, but his eyes were steel, glacial, calculating, utterly devoid of remorse. The police officers didn't look at me. They wouldn't. Luke's desperate explanations, his pleas of innocence, vanished into the evening air like breath against glass, unheard, unheeded. The neighbors peered from behind their curtains and half-open doors, whispering. They saw only what Miles wanted them to see, a concerned husband stopping his wife's aggressive brother from attacking them. I pressed my hands to my lips, trying not to scream. My shirt was torn at the shoulder, my lips split and bleeding, my chest burning where Miles had shoved me moments ago, hard enough to steal my breath. Miles stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder, his smile perfect for anyone watching. The concerned husband, the innocent victim. Luke's eyes met mine across the distance, and I saw the collision of fear and anger in that gaze. He looked back once more as the officers forced him toward the patrol car, and in that moment I saw myself reflected in his desperation, the person I'd become under Miles's careful, methodical control. And Miles looked at me like I was the one to blame, like I was the architect of this disaster, like I always was. That night, I sat on the cold hardwood floor of our sprawling living room, my legs folded beneath me, watching the glow of streetlights paint amber stripes across the pale walls. The house smelled like expensive cologne and industrial-strength bleach. Miles's meticulous attempt to erase the chaos he'd orchestrated, to sanitize the scene for any police investigation that might follow. I whispered my name to myself, grounding myself in the only truth I could control. I'm Vanessa Donovan. The words sounded strange, foreign, like I was speaking about someone else entirely, but I needed them. I needed to remember the woman I had been before he turned every moment into a carefully laid trap, before he learned to weaponize my own love against me. I replayed the scene obsessively. Luke, cuffed and trembling, his face flushed with helpless rage. Miles, calm and untouchable, performing concern like an actor who'd rehearsed his lines 1,000 times. The police, blind by design or by choice, I still didn't know which. And me, silent, small, unseen. My phone buzzed. A text from Miles, sent from upstairs where he'd retreated after the police left. I'm sorry about your brother. He brought this on himself. Come to bed. You need rest. My stomach twisted. In his language, in the carefully constructed world he'd built, I was already supposed to be grateful. Already supposed to understand that Luke's arrest was the natural consequence of his interference. That this was all somehow my fault for not controlling my family. I didn't go to bed. I sat in the darkness and made a decision that would change everything. He had been charming once. Devastatingly, intoxicatingly charming. Miles Donovan appeared in my life like a plot device in a romance novel. Tall, successful, with warm hands and eyes that seemed to see directly into my soul. He wore tailored suits, drove a vintage Mercedes, and owned a philanthropic empire dedicated to women's empowerment. He was exactly what my 28-year-old self believed she wanted. "Vanessa, you're extraordinary," he'd whispered in those early days, his fingers tracing my jawline. "Don't let anyone dim your light." I had believed him completely, desperately, with the fervor of someone who'd never been loved quite this intensely. My older brother Noah had warned me. We'd been close once, before Miles, before everything fragmented. "Be careful," Noah said over coffee 2 months into my relationship with Miles. "He's not what he seems. There's something off about the way he looks at people, like he's assessing them, calculating." I'd laughed then, genuinely amused by what I perceived as my brother's overprotectiveness. "You're paranoid," I'd said. "He's wonderful. He makes me feel safe." But even as I said it, a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered something different. That voice was right. The first time he snapped, it was so subtle I almost missed it entirely. We were at a dinner party with his colleagues. I wore an emerald dress that I loved, one that made me feel confident and beautiful. As we stood near the appetizer table, Miles leaned close and whispered, "That dress is a bit much, don't you think? You look desperate." I froze mid-sip of champagne. "What?" "Nothing," he said smoothly, turning to greet an approaching colleague with his trademark smile. "You look beautiful, of course. I'm just worried people might get the wrong impression." Later, when I laughed too loudly at someone's joke, he pulled me aside. "You're being loud," he said, his voice soft but firm. "People are noticing. It's not very becoming." I started to apologize, then caught myself. But even as I questioned his words, something in me had already begun to shift. A tiny seed of doubt, carefully planted. Then came the small pushes, literally. A hand on my back, firmer than necessary, guiding me in a direction I hadn't chosen. A moment when I stumbled, and he looked at me with something like disappointment. "You're not paying attention," he'd say, voice low and patient. "You're lucky I'm patient with you." And I nodded, too scared to argue, too confused to understand what was happening. By the second year of our marriage, I realized I was disappearing. The Vanessa I had been, bold, laughing, confident, the girl who'd once backpacked through Europe alone and loved every second of it, was evaporating like morning mist. Miles had a way of making the world, and eventually myself, believe that I was fragile, incapable, inherently irrational. A woman who needed his guidance, his steady hand, his superior judgment. I stopped calling my friends. Sarah, my best friend since college, texted me one day, "Haven't seen you in months. Missing you." I read it 3 times, then deleted it without responding. Miles had mentioned, so casually, that Sarah wasn't really the quality of person he wanted me spending time with. She was a distraction. She didn't understand him. She might even be jealous of what we had. I stopped laughing in public. I learned to smile, quietly, nod obediently, and apologize for things I hadn't done. I learned to take responsibility for his moods, his anger, his cruel words. "You made me do this," he'd say after an argument. "You knew how I feel about that. You did it on purpose." And I'd believe him. One evening, we were sitting in our living room, the same room where I'd kneel on the floor weeks later, defeated. Miles was reading the financial section of the newspaper, and I was trying to focus on a novel, but the words wouldn't stay in my mind. Suddenly, he folded the paper and looked at me, really looked at me, with an expression I'd come to recognize and fear. "You're not paying attention," he said. It was his favorite opening. "You never do. You don't understand responsibility. You're selfish, Vanessa. You always have been. I've overlooked so much." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and tell him he was wrong, that he was the one being cruel, that I'd spent months trying to be exactly what he wanted. But I'd learned that words, when sharpened just right by someone who knew all my vulnerabilities, could cut deeper than any physical blow. So I swallowed my words and my fear and said, "I'm sorry. I'll try harder." He returned to his newspaper as if the conversation had never happened, leaving me sitting in the wreckage of my own diminishing self-worth. The isolation was so complete that I almost didn't notice it happening. I walked through our beautiful house like a ghost, from room to room, day after day, imagining escape, dreaming of light and air and the feeling of being seen. But every attempt to reclaim some small part of myself was met with subtle reminders of why I couldn't leave. His charm when I seemed distant, his generosity when I seemed sad, the life we had together, the house, the money, the social status. What would I become without him? Who would I be? No one would believe me anyway. My family had largely stopped reaching out, discouraged by Miles's cool politeness toward them. My friends had moved on, and everyone else saw only what Miles wanted them to see. The perfect woman married to the perfect man, the philanthropist who donated millions to women's shelters and gave TED Talks about supporting female empowerment. The irony was a knife twisted in my ribs every single day. I became a ghost in my own home, unseen by the world, invisible even to myself. Luke showed up at our door on a Tuesday evening in October. My younger brother, who Miles had successfully convinced me to keep at arm's length, stood on our porch with his jaw clenched and his eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen before. "Vanessa, I need to talk to you," he said, trying to push past me into the house. Miles appeared in the hallway behind me, his expression one of mild concern. "Is everything all right?" "No," Luke said, ignoring him and focusing entirely on me. "It's not." I ran into Sarah at the coffee shop downtown. She told me things about what's been happening here. She showed me pictures. "Vanessa, why didn't you tell me?" My blood went cold. Sarah, she'd been calling, texting, showing up on the periphery of my life, refusing to accept the distance Miles had created. She'd seen a bruise on my arm 2 months ago. Miles had grabbed me too hard, and I'd cried, and he'd apologized profusely and been kind for exactly 3 days before the cruelty resumed. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said automatically, but my voice wavered. Miles stepped forward, and I felt his hand on my shoulder. Warm, possessive. "Your brother seems upset. Perhaps he should leave. It's not healthy to let family drama stress you out, Vanessa. It's not good for your nervous condition." My nervous condition. What he meant was my tendency to call him on his lies, my moments of resistance, my occasional flare-ups of self-preservation instinct. "What did Sarah tell you?" I whispered to Luke, ignoring Miles, "That he's been hitting you, that you're terrified of him, that you haven't left because he's convinced you that you have nowhere to go and no one who'd believe you." The words hung in the air like a confession. Miles's grip on my shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's ridiculous. Vanessa, tell your brother how happy we are. Tell him this is all a misunderstanding." But I couldn't. For the first time in 2 years, I couldn't lie. "Get out of my house," Miles said to Luke, and his voice had changed. The charm was gone, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. "Make me," Luke replied. It happened so fast. Miles let go of me and moved toward Luke with his fists clenched. They grappled in the hallway, and I screamed. Luke was actually winning. My beautiful, protective brother was actually standing up to the man who'd systematically destroyed me when Miles pulled away and grabbed me. He shoved me hard, harder than he ever had before, and I fell backward against the marble table. My head hit the edge. Stars exploded in my vision. When I could see again, Miles was already on his phone. "Yes, hello, police? I need to report an assault. My wife's brother attacked me. My wife is injured. Yes, we need an ambulance. Please hurry." He hung up and looked at me with something like satisfaction in his eyes. Then he turned to Luke, who was staring in horror at the blood running down my temple. "She'll tell them you attacked her," Miles said calmly. "She'll tell them you tried to hurt us both. Who do you think they'll believe? A violent ex-convict with an assault charge. This was a lie. Luke had no record, or me. A respected philanthropist married to the woman you allegedly assaulted. That's not what happened," Luke said, but his voice had lost its certainty. The sirens were already wailing in the distance. That night, alone on my bedroom floor, while Miles slept the sleep of the righteous, I made a decision. I started documenting everything the very next day. Small voice recordings hidden in my closet behind old shoeboxes. Photographs of bruises, time-stamped and stored in a cloud folder behind a password Miles didn't know. Screenshots of text messages between him and his mistress, a woman named Kara whom he'd been seeing for months, where he discussed his need to keep me compliant and afraid. "She's becoming difficult," he'd written to Kara 3 weeks ago, "but I know how to handle her. She'll do whatever I need her to do." Each note I took, each recording I made, Each bruise I documented strengthened something inside me that had been atrophying for years. Each image, each whisper of truth reminded me one day he would pay, not just for what he'd done to me, but for what he'd done to Luke, for the careful, methodical destruction of my entire sense of self. He underestimated me. He always had. His confidence was a weapon, but it was also his greatest vulnerability. He was so certain of his ability to control me, so assured in his mastery of manipulation, that he'd never considered I might be building a case against him. He'd never imagined I was anything more than the broken woman he'd spent 2 years creating. His arrogance blinded him to the quiet intelligence I was cultivating in the silence. I reached out to Luke through coded messages on a platform Miles didn't know I used. He still loved me. I could feel it in every carefully chosen word. He was scared the assault charge had traumatized him, and he was fighting it in court, but he believed in me. "Tell me what you need," he wrote. "Tell me how I can help." That belief, that unconditional faith in my strength, fueled a fire inside me that I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me that I wasn't a ghost. I wasn't broken beyond repair. I was Vanessa Donovan, bold, intelligent, capable, and I was going to burn this whole thing down. But I had to be smart. I had to be strategic. For 3 months, I documented his patterns, his habits, his overconfidence. I learned exactly when his defenses would be weakest. I discovered that his charity gala, held every October, was his crowning achievement, a night when his public image was most visible, his power most apparent. It was also when he'd be most vulnerable, because I was going to attack that image with surgical precision. I confronted Kara on a Tuesday afternoon in a coffee shop across town. She was exactly what I expected, beautiful in a conventional way, dressed in clothes Miles probably bought her, unaware that she was just another piece in his collection of manipulated people. She didn't even know the full extent of his deception. She thought she was special. I sat down across from her without asking permission. "My name is Vanessa Donovan," I said. "Miles's wife." She went pale. "How did you—" "I need you to help me," I interrupted. "And I need you to listen very carefully to why you should." I spent the next hour laying out everything I'd discovered, not just about her relationship with Miles, but about his other affairs, the women before her, the careful scripts he used to manipulate each one. I showed her screenshots of messages where he mocked her intelligence, her body, her desperate neediness, terms he used with chilling casualness. I watched her face as she realized the truth. She wasn't special. She was interchangeable. She was another victim in a carefully orchestrated system of control. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice hollow. "The truth," I said. "I'm going to expose him. And I need you to testify to the media, to the police, to whoever asks. I need you to tell them that everything he told you about me was a lie, that I'm not unstable or difficult, or any of the things he said, that he's a serial abuser and manipulator." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone. "I have recordings too," she said quietly. I wasn't sure why I was keeping them, but something felt wrong. Maybe I can help. That's when I knew I wasn't alone in this anymore. I spent the next 8 weeks orchestrating every detail. I befriended the media coordinator for Miles's October Gala, a woman named Jennifer, who turned out to have no love for the elite men she worked for. When I explained what I needed, she hesitated for only a moment before agreeing to help. "He's a predator," I told her simply, "and he's going to keep hunting as long as someone doesn't stop him." I contacted the local news station anonymously, providing them with evidence of Miles's corruption and manipulation. I reached out to legal advisors about recording laws in my state, one-party consent, thankfully, which meant my recordings of his confessions were legally admissible. I gathered statements from other women Miles had hurt, women he'd told me didn't matter, women whose lives he'd devastated. Every lie he'd ever told became a brick in the wall I was building against him. I watched him continue his public life. Gala dinners, charity events, interviews where he praised women's causes, and spoke about supporting survivors. Everyone adored him. The world was charmed, and I smiled quietly beside him, like a shadow, while my plans crystallized into something inevitable. The morning of the gala, I woke early and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was someone I'd thought I'd lost forever. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was set. Her hands were steady. I barely recognized her, this version of myself that had survived. I dressed carefully, not in something flashy or designed to attract attention, but in a simple, elegant black gown that would help me disappear into the crowd. I wore my hair down to cover a small scar on my neck, one of Miles's accidents that he'd apologized for profusely before, making sure I never forgot it was my fault. In my small clutch, I carried only one thing, a flash drive containing years of proof, recordings, messages, photographs, testimony from other women, video evidence of his manipulation. Everything. Miles was already dressed when I entered our bedroom, admiring himself in the mirror. He looked magnificent as always, powerful, untouchable. "You look nice," he said, not really looking at me. "Try not to embarrass me tonight." "I'll do my best," I said, and I meant every word. The gala was held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, a glittering palace of marble and crystal and old money. Red carpet, cameras, microphones. Miles posed for photographs, surrounded by influential people and reporters, shaking hands, smiling that perfect smile. He was untouchable, or so he thought. I entered quietly unremarkable and made my way to where Jennifer was managing the technical setup for the evening's presentations. "You're sure?" she asked, looking at the flash drive in my hand. "I'm sure," I said. The speeches began. Miles was introduced to thunderous applause. He took the stage with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for anything. He spoke beautifully about his commitment to women's safety, about the importance of empowerment and justice. The audience hung on his every word. I watched the room full of reporters, the cameras trained on him, the sea of faces absorbing his lies and transforming them into truth simply through the power of his delivery. Then I nodded to Jennifer. She cued the audio. The first sound that echoed through the ballroom was Miles's voice, recorded in our bedroom just weeks ago, confessing his methodology to someone he thought was a confidant. The key is to make them believe they deserve it. Make them believe they're irrational, unstable, that their own judgment can't be trusted. Then they have no choice but to rely on you completely. The room went silent. Miles's smile froze on his face. "Vanessa was almost too easy," his recorded voice continued. "She was strong when I met her, which made it all the more satisfying to break her down. Women like that are the most fun because they fight the hardest before they surrender." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras swung toward Miles, capturing the exact moment his face transformed from confidence to shock to something like fear. Then came the messages between him and Kara, read aloud by a second voice, one of the audio engineers I'd enlisted. Cruel descriptions of me, strategic plans for keeping me isolated, discussions about his other affairs, confessions of the assault charge against Luke being fabricated. Finally, a video played on the massive screen behind him. Kara on camera, describing their affair and the manipulation she'd witnessed. Then Sarah, my oldest friend, describing how she'd watched me disappear. Then 3 other women, each one telling the story of how Miles had hurt them, manipulated them, broken them. The applause was gone. The adoration had evaporated. Now there was only horror, anger, and the unmistakable energy of a predator being exposed. Miles tried to speak, to deny, to charm his way out of it the way he always had. But his voice cracked. His words faltered. The crowd recoiled, physically, leaning away from him as if his corruption might be contagious. His empire, so carefully curated, was collapsing in real time. I stepped forward, moving through the crowd until I stood directly in front of the stage. "This man has built his life on lies," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying through the ballroom. He built it on the destruction of the people around him. He built it on assault and manipulation and calculated cruelty. Tonight, everyone sees the truth. The room erupted. Reporters surged toward the stage. Security moved forward uncertainly, unsure who they were supposed to protect. And then the police arrived. Handcuffs clicked around Miles's wrists. It was a moment I'd replayed in my mind 1,000 times, but the reality was somehow better than I'd imagined. He looked small on that stage, stripped of his charm, his money, his carefully constructed image. He was just a man, and not even a particularly impressive one, now that everyone could see him clearly. He looked at me as they led him away, and his eyes contained something I'd never seen there before. Genuine fear. Not of the arrest, I suspected, but of the loss of control. Of the dissolution of the world he'd spent so much energy maintaining. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "Yes," I replied. "It is." And it was. Luke was released the very next day. The charges against him were dropped immediately, swept away like they'd never existed. We embraced in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by photographers and reporters, and I finally allowed myself to cry. Not tears of sorrow, but of relief so profound it almost broke me in half. "I knew you'd fix it," he whispered into my hair. "I always knew you were stronger than you believed." The case against Miles unfolded over the following months. His lawyers fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings were admissible. The testimony was damning. The messages couldn't be explained away. Other women came forward, more than I'd even known about. His previous victim, who'd left him years ago, gave an interview about how similar his patterns were, how recognizable his manipulation. His charity was dissolved. Investigations were opened into where the donations had actually gone. His reputation, once so carefully cultivated, became toxic. People who'd admired him felt betrayed, humiliated to have been fooled. That anger, that sense of violation, turned into a force that crushed any remaining vestige of his public image. He was convicted on multiple counts of assault, manipulation, and filing a false police report. He received a sentence that ensured he wouldn't hurt anyone else for a very long time. The first night, I slept alone in our house, which would soon be sold, with the proceeds going to a women's shelter. I lay in bed and didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, breathing, feeling the absence of fear for the first time in years. It didn't feel like joy exactly. It felt like reconstruction, like the slow, painful process of putting myself back together, piece by piece, memory by memory. I reconnected with Sarah, with Noah, with the parts of my life that Miles had systematically dismantled. They welcomed me back without making me explain myself. They didn't ask why I'd stayed or why I hadn't left sooner. They simply let me come home to myself. I started therapy, real therapy, not the kind where I sat silently trying not to upset anyone. I began the long work of unpacking the damage, of understanding how I'd allowed myself to be broken down so completely, of rebuilding my sense of self-worth from the ground up. Some days were harder than others. Some days, I'd catch myself apologizing for things I hadn't done, or second-guessing my own judgment, or waiting for someone to tell me I was being irrational. Those patterns don't disappear overnight. They're scar tissue, and scar tissue is strong, but it's also fragile in its own way. But each day I got stronger. Each day I became more myself. A month after Miles's conviction, I received a letter. Not from Miles, he was forbidden from contacting me, but from his mother, defending him, claiming that I destroyed her son for what could only be described as female hysteria and vindictiveness. I read it once, then placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond. I didn't owe her anything. What I realized, during that period of silence and recovery, was that the world is full of people who will side with the predator, people who will find reasons to doubt the victim, people who will insist that surely there's two sides to every story, as if assault and abuse could be negotiated like a business disagreement. But I also realized something more important. That wasn't my problem to fix. My job had been to tell the truth. I'd done that. The rest was up to the world to decide what to do with it. What mattered was that Luke was free, that I was free, that the other women who'd come forward wouldn't be his next victims, that Miles would spend years in prison, with plenty of time to contemplate the destruction he'd caused. That was enough. That had to be enough. 3 months after the gala, I stood on the balcony of a small apartment I'd rented. Mine, chosen by me, decorated exactly as I wanted it. The city sprawled below me, glittering with possibility. I thought about the woman I'd been before Miles. Bold, laughing, confident. I thought about the woman I'd become under his control. Small, frightened, nearly invisible. And I thought about the woman I was becoming now. Not quite the same as before, because that woman didn't know what she knew now, hadn't survived what she'd survived. This new version of me was harder, more careful, more aware of how easily control could be disguised as love, how quickly safety could become a cage. But I was also freer than I'd ever been. For the first time in years, I smiled, fully, freely, and completely. Not the practiced smile I'd worn through my marriage. Not the tentative smile of someone afraid of the consequences of happiness, but a real smile born from genuine joy. I had my life back, my dignity intact, my voice intact. I didn't just end him. I ended the silence. In the months that followed, my story became a testament to what's possible when a victim refuses to disappear. I received messages from other women, some still in abusive situations, some who'd already escaped, some who were just beginning to see clearly for the first time. They thanked me for speaking. They told me my story had given them courage. They said they'd felt so alone, so convinced that no one would believe them, until they saw that someone had. I decided to use that platform. I started working with organizations dedicated to survivors of domestic abuse. I gave talks about the warning signs of manipulation, about how to recognize when control is being disguised as love, about the resources available to anyone trapped in the situation I'd been in. It's not revenge to speak the truth. It's justice. It's healing. It's the radical act of refusing to protect the people who've hurt us by staying silent about what they've done. Luke and I sat on the porch of my apartment, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Going so public? Sometimes the media still reaches out, wanting more details, more drama." I considered the question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I regret nothing. Not the exposure, not the trial, not any of it. Because every time I chose the truth over protecting his reputation, I was choosing freedom. For me, for you, for the women who came after me." "He'll be out in 15 years, you know," Luke said quietly. "I know," I replied. "And when he is, the world will know what he is. That won't change." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the day arrive. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a bird singing, a sound I'd learned to notice again during the long process of rebuilding my life. I thought about the woman I'd been, ghost-like, invisible, disappearing incrementally until barely anything remained. I thought about the moment I decided to fight back, not with violence or anger, but with truth, with documentation, with the refusal to stay silent. Miles had made the catastrophic mistake of thinking I was weak. He'd confused my attempts to keep the peace with an absence of strength. He'd mistaken my withdrawal with defeat. He'd been wrong. And now, as I sat on my own porch in my own home, I was finally beginning to understand the most important lesson of all. The things that don't kill us don't just make us stronger. They make us capable of change. They make us dangerous to anyone who profits from our silence. I raised my coffee cup to the rising sun. "To endings," Luke said, raising his own cup. "To beginnings," I corrected. We clinked our cups together, and for the first time in a very long time, the future didn't terrify me. It inspired me. I spent 2 years believing my silence was kindness, that my invisibility was love, that my survival meant staying small, staying quiet, staying broken. But sitting in that courtroom, watching him lose everything, I understood the truth. Respect is non-negotiable. Your worth isn't defined by anyone else's belief, their seating chart, or their lies about who you are. My silence was a weapon they used against me, until I turned my patience into power. If you've been gaslit into disappearing, if you've convinced yourself that your boundaries make you difficult and your survival makes you selfish, I need you to hear this. You are not weak. You are not broken beyond repair. You are extraordinary simply for refusing to disappear. Share this with someone who's been drowning in someone else's narrative. Tell them their silence doesn't make them victims. It makes them survivors waiting to roar. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about setting boundaries, reclaiming your voice, and turning humiliation into triumph. Because the real revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. Your worth was never in question. It was only ever waiting for you to remember it.